Hi guys, happy Friday, and as promised in my last video, today I was going to do a video on the Missouri Compromise of 1820, of which today marks 200 years since the historic decision was kind of made. And this compromise basically was more over the slavery issue in the United States at the time. And it really had to do with the fact that Missouri had wanted to be admitted as a slave state. Now, how to really start this out, I guess, would be to look back beforehand between 1800 and 1820. As the United States began to grow, such as in 1803, Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory, which more than doubled the size of the nation in the West, especially west of the Mississippi River. The territories would eventually become states. However, there was already an ideological divide between the North and the South due to the factor that in the North there became a kind of a prominent movement to want to abolish slavery in the United States, and the South, where it already existed, there was a movement that they wanted to expand it. They wanted to continue into new territories and have slavery there. And this kind of would play off once in a while, but it never really reached a big climate issue until about 1818. And in this year, the Missouri Territory applied to be admitted as a state to the Union because it had gained enough population and it met the requirements to become a state. However, Missouri wanted to become a slave state, and this kind of set off a kind of riot in Congress because of the factor that the Northerners were concerned that not only was slavery going to expand, but it was also going to offset the balance of power. Because at this time, there were 11 free states that did not allow slavery, and there were 11 slave states that did allow it. And this kind of balanced the power out in Congress between the two opposing sides. If Missouri was admitted as a slave state, then that means the balance of power would be tipped in favor of the southern slaveholding states. Well, due to this, Congress kind of debated heavily over whether to admit Missouri as a slave state or not. And eventually they kind of came to a small agreement, mostly due to the factor that a representative from New York, let me see here, James Tallmadge from New York, he was a representative from New York, he kind of put an amendment that would be included if Missouri was admitted as a state. And in this amendment, Tallmadge basically had provided a process that although Missouri would indeed be admitted as a slave state, this amendment would eventually cause slavery to be ended in the state in future years to come. Now, this was not very popular with the Southerners at all because they wanted slavery for as long as it could be. Well, this proposed bill did pass through the Senate, but it passed with a very slim majority, only because the northern side kind of had a majority in the Senate. And unfortunately, when it got to the House, it did not pass. And this issue was kind of left undecided for another 2 years. Well, 1820 comes and Missouri once again applies for admission as a slave state, and the issue begins again. Eventually, what happened was Congress finally came to a conclusion that they could do a compromise between the two sides that would benefit each. In exchange that they would admit Missouri as a slave state that year, the Northern Territory of Massachusetts, which was known as the Maine Territory, would be admitted as the new free state of Maine to balance the power out between the two opposing sides, so that each side would gain one state. And then, as a further additive to this compromise, it was stated that to try to conceal the Northerners' fears and to try to appease the Southerners, it was decided that slavery would be, for all future years to come, when making a new state out of the Louisiana Territory lands, or any lands in general that would be coming to the United States in that time, slavery was forbidden anywhere north of Missouri's southern border at latitude 3630, with the exception of Missouri. There would be no new slave states admitted north of that line. Only Missouri would be the exception. and this kind of appeased the Northerners and it appeased the Southerners slightly, but it still did not entirely, because of the fact it did not abolish slavery outright, and it did not exactly solve the question once and for all of whether slavery was right or wrong. And the Southerners had wanted to expand slavery as much as they could, and this kind of also still proved a hindrance, because although they had lands that they could expand it to, they were being limited to how far they could expand it to, and they did not like this. And the Northerners, of course, were mad because it did not abolish slavery and it allowed it to spread to another state. Well, this kind of compromise, although it was shaky, it did pass, and 5 days later, on March 6th, it was signed into law by President James Monroe at the time, and this was in 1820. Missouri was admitted about a couple months after that year, and Maine was admitted in 1821, the following year. And this also set a precedent to how new states were admitted in the future, because it was very common for, if a slave state was admitted, a free state was to follow, or if a free state was admitted, a slave state was to follow. For example, Arkansas was admitted as a slave state in 1836, and the following year, in 1837, Michigan was admitted as a free state. And then in 1845, both Florida and Texas were admitted to the Union as slave states, and in 1846, Iowa was admitted as a free state, and in 1848, Wisconsin was admitted as a free state. Excuse me. Well, this compromise worked for a while, but then again, it had its problems. And eventually, it was kind of rendered basically null and void in 1854. Because in this year, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed by Congress, and this act was mostly for the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. The slavery issue was starting to heat up again, and under the kind of support of President Franklin Pierce, it became law that these territories, although under the Missouri Compromise, they were not supposed to have slavery, given that they were north of that 3630 latitude, it was basically decided that they could choose for themselves whether to have slavery in their borders or not when they became admitted as states. And this really set off the issue again, and much more than it did in the Missouri Compromise, because this time you actually had pro-slavery citizens and abolitionists actually fighting in Kansas in particular, so much that it became known as Bloody Kansas because of how much they were killing each other, just trying to influence and get enough pro-slavery or abolitionist votes to turn the state into either a free or slave state, which eventually, in Kansas's case, it became a free state in 1861, and Nebraska was not admitted until after the Civil War, and by that time slavery had been abolished. Well, unfortunately, this kind of rendered the compromise null and void, because the amp up the fight. Well, if these people get to choose where they want to have slavery, why is it being limited? And for years, the Southerners had really been arguing that it was not right to limit slavery, given that they were considered to be property, and it was like forbidding a man to take his dog with him almost, in their eyes, because in their eyes, slaves were not people, they were property, and you couldn't deprive a person of their property, and they claimed that it was protected under the Fifth Amendment. Well, unfortunately, another blow came to the factor that in 1857, the Dred Scott case took place at the Supreme Court. And in this case, it was basically decided that, a former slave had sued his former master for claiming that he was now a free man, because his master had moved and lived for a couple of years in a free state, which was Wisconsin, and then moved back down south. The slave, Dred Scott, had argued that due to him having lived in a free state for a couple of years where slavery was forbidden and outlawed, he was legally free. Well, the Supreme Court said otherwise, and one of the most corrupt and just probably most failed jurisdictions it's ever delivered. It stated that Dred Scott was not a free man because his master had lived in the free state. That did not make him free, because slaves were property. They were not people. And to add on to that, they basically made the comment that all slaves within the United States, be they a current slave or be they a former slave, were not citizens of the United States, and thus were not subject to the rights entitled to human beings in the country, which was really I don't know how the Supreme Court could ever come to a decision like that, but they did. It was very messed up. Well, in the process, they also declared that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had also been unconstitutional in the fact that it had prohibited slavery, which, according to the Southerners and according to the Supreme Court's ruling, was protected under the Fifth Amendment right, that it was a property to that person and not a human being. So the Missouri Compromise outright it didn't solve the slavery issue. It brought a peace for about for a couple of years, or roughly maybe 30 or so, but it did not solve the issue. And more than often, all it probably did was kind of hold off the issue of the slavery debate and the Civil War that would eventually come from it. And the factor, it was seen by some back then that it was not going to be a good thing, that slavery was going to tear this nation apart. Because even Thomas Jefferson, who was actually alive still at this time, had actually made the comment that when he heard of this Missouri issue over the debate over it, he once called it the death knell of the Union, because he initially kind of surmised in his mind that slavery was going to be a big problem in the years to come. Now, unfortunately, Jefferson did not live long enough to see what would eventually happen, as he died 6 years later in 1826. But him and some of the others had really seen back then that it was going to be a major problem in the country, and that the Missouri Compromise, although it kind of staved off and led to a small peace for a while, all it was really doing was delaying the issue even further until it would have to be dealt with. So although the Missouri Compromise did solve the issue at the time, again, it did not abolish slavery, it did not permanently end it, it did not solve it once and for all, and it kind of just how would you say it here? Trying to prevent the inevitable that was going to happen, and either slavery was going to be abolished, or it was going to be expanded, or there was going to be a war. And eventually war came about, which was in 1861, roughly 41 years after. So as of today, we look back at this decision just kind of wondering, how did it work? We kind of look and see, how did we really even think this was an okay idea? Because, the truth be told, the right decision should have just been to abolish slavery entirely, but this would not have worked. And under the Missouri Compromise, may I add that if it had been kept in place all these years and slavery had never been abolished, then the states of Texas, Arkansas, all the other let's all the states here that would be slave states. You'd have Virginia, you would have Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and it's possible that California may not have been a whole state because the southern part of California would fall under that jurisdiction and possibly be there. And so would, if I'm not wrong, I think Oklahoma would also have fallen under that rule, and part of Colorado and Utah. Well, not Utah, but Nevada. But if this compromise had been kept in place, that is what, but slavery had never been abolished, that is what the nation would look like. Those would be the states that would somehow either have slavery that was still legal, or it would have part of it where it was legal. But anyway, this compromise, although it was good, I think, for the time, and the fact it kind of delayed the issue, because the nation was still weak at the time, it was still a growing nation, I don't think it was exactly the best decision due to the factor it just simply, like I've said, it just staved off the issue. Although it was good for doing so, it also was bad for doing so because it just put off the issue until later when eventually we'd have to get rid of it. And as one historical figure in history, I think, said, and I think this also came from Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson had known that slavery was going to be an issue, and he had even stated that slavery was basically a weed, and that eventually, if we did not do something, it was going to become so embedded into American society that when we finally pulled the weed or uprooted it, it was going to be long and it was going to be bloody and painful, which eventually it was. It took a 4-year bloody war to end slavery, and this remains to this day one of the most deadly wars in American history. But anyway, that's what the Missouri Compromise basically was. I will be posting a link to a video that I've seen that it actually explains it very, very well, to about the same degree that I did, but a little more clarity. And basically, that's all I had for today. So today we celebrate, well, not celebrate, but remember the Missouri Compromise, because it wasn't exactly for a good thing. But we remember it today for its historic decision and what happened. But that is the gist of the Missouri Compromise. I will be posting at least 2 videos next week. One I know of is I'm still going to follow the pattern of how it's been historical anniversaries during the week. And next week, at least, I will reveal one for right now. I will keep the other one a secret. But on March 10th, on next Tuesday, I believe, I will be doing one on the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1840 between the United States and Mexico, which gained us the territories that would eventually become the states of California, Arizona, New Mexico, the rest of Texas, Utah, Nevada. Gained us all that from Mexico because of March 10th, 1848 being the day that the treaty that ended this war was officially signed, which was the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. But I will discuss that more on next Tuesday. And the other video will be coming out, I think, next Friday, but I will keep that one a secret for now over what the topic will be. So until next time, I hope everyone has a safe and fun weekend, and hope to see you back very soon. If you liked this video or enjoyed it at all, please be sure to either subscribe or place a comment in the comments below. And as always, feel free to put any suggestions you may have for any historical topics in the comments below or in the discussions page on my channel. So in the meantime, have a safe weekend, have a good day, and we'll see you hopefully sometime next week.